My name is John Brink and we are podcasting on the Brink. Today is a special day because we are podcasting BC forest industry and crisis. It reflects on the BC forest industry, but also on the forest industry globally, North America and Europe. The other part is very important. It is June the 6th today, and June the 6th we remember Operation Overlord, the code name for the Battle of Normandy, which was the liberation of Europe. And to me, that in particular is important because I was born in 1940 and lived during the first part, in particular, of the war in Europe, in particular in Holland, in northeastern Holland. It was a difficult time, and I remember, even today, I remember it well. From the time that I was 3.5 years old, I remember the planes overhead, hundreds of them, bombing, Allied planes bombing Germany and the factories that prepared equipment for the war. And then at the same time, it was a difficult time because in particular 1944-45 was the hunger winter and the hunger year because they had cut off all the supplies. And the winter of 1944-45 was remembered as the coldest winter on record. It was also the time that we as kids, and I remember it well, every morning we would go to the railroad yards and to collect anything edible or burnable. I still can feel the hunger, the anxiety, and the cold from that period. And we saw far too much that we should not have seen. And PTSD became part of our lives. We also remember this month as the PTSD month. Coming back to the war, we were liberated by the Canadian Army, April the 12th, 1945. It left such an impression on me that I always knew from that point forward that I would go to the land of my heroes, Canada. It took a number of years later that I started to work in a furniture factory at the age of 13 that I developed the love for lumber and working with wood. My dad was working in lumber and my grandfather was a master carpenter. So my dream became to go to Canada and then build my own lumber mill. I was going to go when I was 17, but my parents wouldn't let me. I was drafted into the Dutch Air Force, and then I left Holland when I was 23 years old to go to British Columbia to build the dream I had of a lumber mill. It was in the summer of 1965 that I arrived in Vancouver and couldn't speak the language, didn't know a soul, didn't have a job. And I went to the immigration office and talked to a German fella, and I could speak some German, and told them what I wanted to do. I wanted to build a lumber mill. He told me, go to Prince George. That's where they are building the mills, 1965, pulp mills. It's a boom town, and so that's exactly what I did. I went to the bus, 12 hours to Prince George, came off the bus in Prince George. I had a suitcase, 3 books, 2 sets of clothes, and I counted my money at least 3 times. I had exactly $25.47. But I had a dream. I had attitude. I always have a positive attitude. No matter how tough the day is, I believe tomorrow will be better. I had the passion to build my lumber mill in Canada, and then I'm a hard worker. So I started to work as a clean-out man in August of 1965 in 𝗙𝗏𝗏, and that's about 75 miles south of Prince George. At the sawmill that I worked, I was a lumber pilot, but at the same time I watched the industry already considering my dream of building my own mill. Most of the mills in the Quesnel area were in the railroad area, and they're 2 mile flat. And some of the mills that would become some of the largest ones, not only in BC or North America, but in the world, was a company by the name of West Fraser Timber. It was then started in Quesnel with 3 brothers, the Ketchum brothers, that became a large company. There were also a number of other smaller mills that would develop into bigger operations. I stayed there for about 2 months, and then there was an opportunity in Prince George for a job, and I got a job in a company called Netherlands Overseas. More coincidence than anything. And I started as a cleanup man, became then a lumber pilot, and within a year and a half, I became a superintendent. Even that didn't go quick enough for me. I wanted to build my own mill. And so one of the impressions that I got of the mills, in particular the one in Prince George, I could not believe how much of the log and the timber that you were cutting would go up the burner. The other part of my background was in Holland. Already I worked for one of the larger importers of lumber in Western Europe, a company by the name of 𝗙𝗢𝗥𝗘𝗦𝗧. Now, the culture that I grew up in, you would not dare to step on a piece of lumber. You just didn't do that. And if you did, you would feel it in your back for quite a while to come, and you would not do it again. After 2 years, in 1967, I got an option to buy part of a sawmill, a little sawmill, and of all places, the Yukon Territory. It was Watson Lake, and the company's name was Watson Lake Lumber. It was a small mill. It was a mill that would become something that is part of the history of the forest industry in the northern interior in particular, but also in the Yukon. The sawmill was located in the bush. It had a main cutting saw, and then an edger and trim saws. And then the wood would be piled and rough and then sent to the planer mill in town, in Watson Lake. I stayed there for about 5 years in Watson Lake. I then decided to go back again to Prince George and again work for the same company I was working for before. And started to think about, how do I start my lumber mill? And starting in particular with having very, very little money. I again became very quickly a superintendent. I became a cost accountant and a sales manager for the operation that I was working for. And then in 1975, October 1975, I started Brink Forest Products with $25,000, with the idea of a different product, a value-added manufactured product. I had seen that lots of the lower grade lumber was cut up into smaller pieces, or lumber that would be sold in the marketplace. The problem with it was that they ended up with too many short pieces with no place to go. I introduced in 1975 finger jointing lumber, where we glue shorter pieces together in longer pieces. Initially, when I started that process, it was thought that that would not be possible. There would be no market for it. We developed a market for our products in the United States, in particular in Texas. And it became, over the years, very, very successful. So the reason that I give you my background before I start talking about the BC forest industry in crisis is to give you a feeling of my background. I spent 70 years in the lumber industry, 10 years in Europe, in Holland in particular, and then 60 years in British Columbia. I worked right from the ground up, and I did mainly and looked mainly on further manufacturing, not only in Holland, but also in Sweden. And on my mind, when I first came here, is I looked around this amazing province in this amazing country, Canada, in particular BC, and all the timber that we have in this province, and the quality of timber, certainly in my opinion, was at the world level of timber being used for construction. I developed a special attraction to further manufacturing or value-added manufacturing of lumber into other products. I had seen that in Europe, I saw it in Sweden, and I always viewed that as a major opportunity. I was amazed about a lot of times why we did so little further manufacturing, and already when I started Brink Forest Products in 1975, started lobbying government and other sources, and became a member of the Council of Forest Industry, always a proponent of not only manufacturing dimension lumber, but also manufacturing in addition or complementary to that value-added products. I was the founding president of an organization called the BC Council of Value-Added Wood Processors, an organization, and me as the founding president, that had 800 members, 8 associations throughout BC. The key to that particular organization was always the same. Access to fiber was difficult, and getting responses from the then primary sector was also difficult to attract continuous access to fiber. Obviously, it is no surprise to anybody that if you have a primary mill, that even in those days, in 1975, tens of millions of dollars would be required to build a primary facility, if not more than 100 million, even then already, and then to build secondary manufacturing plant that would also require a very major investment of capital, and difficult to obtain money usually from bankers, because if you have no access to fiber, then obviously the banker is not overly, or the lender is not overly impressed with lending money to secondary manufacturers. We were able to secure access to timber and the small business program, as they called it, which was about 20% of the annual allowable cut in the province. That stimulated investment in further manufacturing and in secondary manufacturing. Unfortunately, what happens in provinces like BC, every 4 years we have an election where we either elect a left-leaning government or a right-leaning government, and everybody has different opinions about what policies they should follow, in particular as it relates to the forest industry, which is still, even today, considered, and less so now, likely, be one of the major economic drivers in the province. So unfortunately, in early 2000, 2002, 2003, the incumbent government decided to remove the access to fiber for secondary manufacturers, which meant that investment depleted, companies went out of business because of lack of access to fiber. There were other elements involved as well that are still very much part of today. Today we have very little involvement in value-added manufacturing, far less than it could be, in my opinion. And part of it is government policy, provincial policy in particular, but also another problem that exists is that softwood lumber duty that the American government charges towards lumber being imported into the United States did not used to include secondary manufacturers, other than they would pay duties on the basis of input value of the products, the raw material going into the plant, if they had no tenure or timber rights. Unfortunately, that was changed or was not negotiated in the newer agreements with the US government, and it resulted in that now we have a policy that the more value you add to the products that we manufacturing, as secondary manufacturers in the province of British Columbia pay full duty. What does that mean? A company which is a mid-sized company like us, Brink Forest Products, for instance, since 2018, have paid close to $70 million in duties. That part alone should not exist, in my opinion, in terms of that we must do more further manufacturing in the province. So that brings us further to what happened to the industry then since 2000 in particular. A couple of things happened is that in the interior of the province in particular, we had the pine beetle epidemic that became a major disaster. The pine beetle volume at that point is about 30% of the annual allowable cut, or of the forest in British Columbia, in the interior of British Columbia. Up to 60-70% of the pine stands were affected by the pine beetle. So which ultimately would result in a lowering of the annual allowable cut. So what then is the annual allowable cut? Well, the province has calculated over time already that if a tree takes 60 years to grow to maturity, then it will make sure that we maintain the same available volume. We grow as much as we cut to maintain stability in the available fiber to the, in particular, the primary sector. That part, obviously, with the reduction because of the pine beetle, was very much affected. So put it into perspective, how much of the pine beetle attacked the lodgepole pine. The effect was about 90 million cubic meters, or nearly 1 billion cubic meters of timber would have to be harvested, otherwise it would be wasted because of pine beetle. That would reflect about 15 years cut in the province of British Columbia at about 60 million cubic meters annually. So the effect of the pine beetle epidemic substantially lowered the amount of annual cut being available. Other things that happened to reducing the annual allowable cut were fires, for one, global warming indirectly, and then other things that happened is changes to forest policy. So the annual allowable cut of the wood, the timber available to the primary sector is critical to not only sustain our current operations, sawmilling operations, but also to potentially attract further investment in the industry in British Columbia. Now, we must realize that the lumber industry is a global industry. We have to be able to compete globally in terms of cost, products, and products quality, but in particular in regards to cost. I find it also interesting that if we look globally, then looking at British Columbia in particular, we have a resemblance to, in a lot of cases, to Sweden. Sweden is interesting because I spent time in Sweden when I worked for the company in Holland before I came to Canada, and became familiar with not only their products that we imported in Holland, but also in terms of their operations that were distinctly different. What's the difference between us and Sweden? Well, let's first look at the similarities. The similarities are that we have equally the same about 22 million hectares of forest land. Virtually the similarities. The total volumes logged are in Sweden about, and this stat is a bit of an older one, but is substantially higher in Sweden than it would be in British Columbia. And then the value of products, the log exports, and all of those other elements are similar to us in terms of quality and fiber being exported. Where there is a difference is that in BC, the ownership of the timber in British Columbia, 95% of the timber is owned by you and me, if you're in BC, the people of British Columbia. Since the United States Declaration of the Rights of the Indigenous People, UNRAP, and the BC accepting that, and Canada accepting that, there have been changes in the allocation of timber. So that has had an effect on the annual allowable cut. So kind of going back to the start of the pine beetle in 2000, and then harvesting that volume during a period when the annual allowable cut was around 50 million cubic meters annually. It was uplifted to take care of and to recover as much of the pine beetle lodgepole pine as possible, and pushed up as high as 70 to 75 million cubic meters annually. It became obvious that after the pine beetle had been used up or taken care of, meaning that most of the economically viable timber had been harvested, that the annual allowable cut would be reduced to, again, a sustainable level. It also had another result, is that the cost of harvesting and the associated cost to the mills that were harvesting had tenure, that means renewable licenses, that in those that were relying on open market wood, BC Timber Supply, for instance, that the price of timber had substantially gone higher than it was before. And so the mills increasingly had more difficulty to be competitive globally. It also resulted in capital investors looking at the industry in British Columbia and looking for other options that were more attractive to them than BC would be or looked like it would be in the future. So, for instance, in particular in the US Southeast part, where there is southern yellow pine, mainly private wood that could be bought and manufactured, the cost per cubic meters delivered to the mill would be in the area of $45 US per cubic meter, where at the same time in Canada, the cost would be well in excess of $100 US per cubic meter. So it became increasingly more difficult to be competitive. The cost in general of the bureaucracy surrounding the Ministry of Forest it became less and less attractive to become competitive here, but not only that, or to become profitable. So gradually the mills left British Columbia, started in towards the latter part of 2000, when it became obvious the annual allowable cut would go down, and government policies were negative towards being competitive globally, and mills left. So where today, where in early 2000 we would have up to 120 mills, primary mills in British Columbia, we are now down to somewhere around 60. Especially in looking at the interior, we probably now, in June of 2024, we're probably in danger of losing another 5, 6, 7 maybe, some people would speculate, mills in the, not only in the interior, but also additional capacity down the coast. Secondary manufacturing subsequently has become much more difficult because the industry can only operate as a whole. That means that in order to have secondary manufacturing or incremental manufacturing of chips and sawdust and shavings into pellets, which mainly rely on residuals created by the primary sector, and for secondary manufacturers, in particular the ones that rely on lumber being manufactured by the primaries, the less primary manufacturing we have, then the opportunity to attract investment in secondary manufacturing highly unlikely. So where does that put us now? The annual allowable cut in the interior of the province is around 50 million cubic meters annually. But the facts are that the annual allowable cut is much closer to 40, and the way things are being predicted to go forward, maybe as low as 32 million cubic meters. The challenge then will be is more mills will shut down because of lack of fiber. And what is the reason for the annual allowable cut being at 50, now at 40 and at 32? There are a number of issues involved, in particular in regards to government policy in terms of caribou, in terms of First Nations, and other changes that have taken place, that the annual allowable cut or the permits required for mills to plan forward for logging and harvesting certain areas are subject to approval for a number of reasons that involve differences of opinions between nations or First Nations. It involves caribou. It involves a whole lot of issues that make in old growth, and that make the issuing of permits, which are critical to a successful forest industry that can plan forward, that cannot be completed. And so therefore, for existing mills to plan forward, it is virtually impossible. Now, all of that is becoming even more problematic and difficult as we go forward. There must be predictability in terms of access to fiber. In the meantime, thousands of jobs have been lost. Communities like Fort Nelson, Fort St. John, Chetwynd, Prince George, Vanderhoof, Bear Lake, Burns Lake, Houston, and a number of other communities have lost thousands and thousands of jobs. The province of British Columbia used to employ 186,000 jobs in 2000. Today, we employing more closer to the estimated amount of 62,000 jobs, which means a loss of nearly 120,000 jobs in communities. That is extremely serious. That are people that build their careers and their lives on the forest industry in jobs that now disappear. Much of the problems that we have today relate to governments, both the BC government and then also other stakeholders that have access to fiber, that the predictability of access to fiber today makes it extremely difficult to attract investors in not only operating their mills in our region or in the province of British Columbia, and even less so building additional new mills, as we already have seen. And the other part of it is that secondary manufacturers that are being attracted to invest in value-added manufacturing. I'm just like everybody else. I fly around a lot in the province of British Columbia, and we must wonder, as you fly in an airplane, I always sit at the window and I look outside, say it's paradise, British Columbia in Canada, for me. But the other part that I notice is that we have so much timber. How could that possibly be? The critical part here, in my opinion, is forest policy. It's critical to create comfort to the investor, that we will not have a forest industry unless we have capital that has reasonable expectation of profitability. We will, which is secondary important, is how do we attract entrepreneurs that are seeing the dream, the hope, or the potential of investing in the forest industry in British Columbia, in particular in secondary manufacturing, if there is no reasonable expectation of access to fiber. Why would they? And for the ones that already have invested, unless they have comfort in the future, meaning what's going to happen in the next 5, 10, 20, 30, 40 years from now, they need to know that. We need to have stability. We don't have that today. And that is one of the biggest problems. If I look at provincial policy, every 4 years we have an election where government goes to the left or to the right. We have an election coming up on October the 19th. We don't know which way it will go. But one thing we know for sure is that we likely have, again, a new Minister of Forest. Every 4 years, this is a different government. They usually elect a new Minister of Forest, and ministers in different files, for that matter. And that, that in midterm, every second year, they elect or usually chose or change the Minister of Forest. And again, we start all over again with forest policy. The second one is that we have the BC government that controls 95% of the timber, but since 𝗙𝗢𝗥𝗘𝗦𝗧, or the Declaration of the Rights of the Indigenous People, 𝗙𝗢𝗥𝗘𝗦𝗧, in accepting that, and I support that, we will have not only the BC government that has control over 95% of the timber, but so does First Nations will have control over, right now around 12%, but it is supposed to go to around, and in some areas already does, to 20% of the timber. What's the challenge? I support that. But what's the challenge? Well, the BC government, but then with the First Nations, there are 206 First Nations in British Columbia. And as First Nations have elections every 2 years, quite democratic, and they become very contentious at times, but they will again change policy. So we will then look at it from the investor's point of view, that we have the BC government changing direction, then add to that 206 First Nations, say for all intents and purposes, we have 207 governments that have difficulty in respectfully understanding the industry and trying to give comfort to the investor and the entrepreneur in terms of opportunity. That simply cannot and will not happen. So what do we do from here on forward is then the big question in my mind. I believe we have to have forest policy which reflects us being competitive globally, because it is a global market. Secondly, the question is, are we planting enough trees for what we harvest? I would suggest from my experience, the 60 years that I've been here, we didn't, up until the mid-80s, when government policy made it planting of trees the responsibility of tenure holders or those that control the timber. Since that time, we have not only caught up to planting trees, but exceeding it. So for every tree we cut, we plant 3. The quality of the timber that we plant is superior to what was there before. So what then can we do? How come that, again, looking at Sweden by comparison, we can grow 50% more volume per hectare than what we are getting now? Now, Sweden had the same problems as we did 40, 50 years ago. They changed the industry, although ownership is different. Here is 95% governments, First Nations and BC government. And in Sweden, it is just the other way around. Governments are limited for the amount of forest they control. It's mainly private. The mills are smaller then, and they actively, in 40, 50 years ago, they had the same problem we have. Too much capacity, not enough timber. Mills shut down. They changed forest policy. Now, we are forecasting 50 million cubic meters annually in the province of British Columbia, in the interior in particular. In Sweden, they are now, and they used to be the same as we are, now they are close to 100 or in excess of 100 million cubic meters annually, and going towards 120 million. They have too much timber, not enough capacity. What are they doing? Tending to the timber that they are growing. They're looking at it as a renewable resource where you must be doing thinning. In some cases, in Sweden, they do 3 cycles over the duration of growing the fiber. How does the growing fiber work here? And I'm not a registered forester, but I know enough about the industry that I know in Sweden, the cycle is somewhat shorter than ours, probably 50, 40 years, maybe in some cases. The further north you go, the longer the cycle, in some cases 60 years there. In the southern yellow pine, maybe 30, 35 years, the cycle, where for us in the interior of British Columbia, 60, 70, 80 years. So we can increase the yield if we have intensive forest managing. It's a yield. I believe that volume-based tenure does not create an incentive to tend to the fiber, because if you do, somebody may end up with all the effort you put into it, but you're growing more fiber. And I suggest area-based tenures are much more attractive than volume-based tenure. I basically don't believe in the tenure system. I believe the smaller the amounts of tenure and the more we have in the open market, the better it would be. It was already recognized by H.R. Macmillan way back in 1940, 45, 50, 1950, that too much of the timber will be controlled by a few companies. That's exactly what happened. and that politicians and bureaucrats should not be allocating timber because there is too much nuts, wink stuff going on. That then already became a problem. So those are again areas. The other part that I believe that that it was Premier John Organ that gave notice to the industry collectively, I believe it was in April of 2019, and saying there must be more involvement of First Nations. That's happening. We must be more sensitive to old growth. I support that. I support more involvement of First Nations, more concerned about old growth, and the other one is to have more value-added manufacturing. I'm obviously a major component of that. And so what happened to First Nations? We likely went too far, too quick, that, that unless there is an agreement between First Nations and the BC government of managing the forest in the annual allowable cut and the cost around it, that they will not attract primary or keep primary capacity. And if they do not have an understanding between the two groups, then capital will leave and we will end up with no mills. It is of no interest, and certainly not to the government of British Columbia, since the forest industry was the biggest economic driver in the province, that if we have no more sawmills here, then I'm not sure, and I'm sure that even First Nations understand that if there is no one to sell your timber to, that's not going to benefit them either. There must be an agreement between them to create stability in moving forward. And I believe that's critical. The other part, as we are sitting here and saying, where do we go from here? And how about value-added manufacturing? Well, value-added manufacturing, again, because of government policy, primarily is not defending added value with the Americans and should have been exempted from duties because the allegation was subsidized timber. Well, most of them don't have timber, but they became collateral damage and they threw them under the bus, unfortunately. That we again must look at value-added manufacturing. I believe that the future of the province is, as that I mentioned during John Organ, then Premier Organ, announced that the intentions paper, where we will add more social and economic value to the resource, and speaking about First Nations more involvement. And I said, and I was asked to speak about the intentions paper. I agree with those two. In terms of value added, the way I see it is that the sawmills will be smaller. I believe there will be more and more pressure from the public on our potency that smaller mills in the region where it becomes innovative primary in the regions in combination with intensive secondary. Innovative primary in combination with incentive secondary, either practiced by the primary producers or by strategic relationship between primaries and secondaries, or independent from that by independence. I believe that's where it will go. The forest belongs to the public of this province, and they must be proactive in that. I'm trying to put a deal together already for quite a number of months where I try to work closely with First Nations as Brink Forest Products. We are likely the largest value-added manufacturer in the province. We are running at 50% capacity. I intend to put together a deal with a First Nations group or individual nations, for that matter, here in central British Columbia, is saying that we intend to find or purchase a mill that has been shut down and put a deal together between First Nations and me as a secondary and put an agreement together, is saying, let's purchase a mill, let's take the timber that they will now control, pay market value for it in a NUCO, and then develop a secondary manufacturing facility alongside of it. Brink already is the most successful secondary manufacturer, has been in business for 50 years. That's the proposal that I have made to First Nations, and trying to purchase a mill that has been shut down here in Prince George, in particular the Polar Mill being north of Prince George, that otherwise likely would be taken apart and shipped to the United States. I said, let's keep it here. Let's put a deal together between the most successful secondary manufacturer and First Nations and the new owners of the mill that likely will have to take it apart and then ship it to the United States, and start a new turn and saying, let's do this. Let's put a primary manufacturer together with First Nations and a value-added manufacturer and take a new direction. What would it do in terms of jobs? Brink still employs close to 300 now, normally 400. We would add another 150 jobs at Brink because we are in the process of building a mass timber plant in addition to what we already have. What would it do for Polar if we had a new combination of interest, First Nations, primary, and me as a secondary? We would reestablish close to 180 jobs. That is 200, that's 350 jobs. Multiplied is usually 3, so 3 times, I would say 1,200 jobs, between 1,200 and 1,500 jobs would be created by this initiative alone. That's what I believe we have to do. Let's do something different. Let's take the approach not from the whole place is shutting down, if we are no longer competitive. Let's take a new turn. It's your timber, it's your province, and to First Nations saying that we cannot deal with 106 governments and the BC government, 107, if we do not agree that the forest in this province is an economic driver to not only the BC government, but also to First Nations, and to preserve that, and not only preserve it, but to stimulate that in terms of all the other values. I recognize all the other values that are important for First Nations. It's not necessarily making lumber, but that, again, is a very important part of it. So my view is that the future is a bright one if we see it, that I believe we're still extremely fortunate to where we live, with a province that has the ability to grow fiber, no different than Sweden is doing, that we need to recognize that forest policy that we have today does not benefit the people of the province, meaning in the nations and First Nations, that we must together find a direction that will attract capital or maintain the capital that we have here, and that not only that, but stimulate further manufacturing, that there is such a huge opportunity in further manufacturing, and have policies that support that. And the time is now, because as far as the forest industry is concerned, in crisis, we are at the period that Rome is burning. Today is the time to make difficult decisions.